Hello, welcome to our 7th lesson in this video series on Theme D, Religion, Peace and Conflict. This lesson is all about victims of war. Today we're thinking about what can be done to help victims of war and to understand the work of a present-day Christian organisation that helps victims of war. What do you need to know? You need to know that war in its nature creates many victims. And Christians are commanded to care about these victims and to care for their needs in practical ways. Let's jump on in. So, whether a Christian is a pacifist, which is a word we're going to explore a bit more in a lesson to come. I know we talked about it already. It's someone who's anti-war, anti-violence, or if they believe in just war theory, so they think that war is a necessary evil sometimes, they will all be concerned about the victims of war. Now, who are the victims of war? Well, take this picture for inspiration. Pause the video here and make a list of anyone you think who could be described as a victim of war. And when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll look at some victims of war. So potentially you wrote those who were killed in war, and that's a nice obvious one there, that absolutely if you go to fight in a war and you are killed, then you are a victim of war. Also, if you're injured in battle, you would be a victim of war. But let's look on a wider scale. People who've lost their homes due to warfare. One of the effects of war is mass displacement, often when many people need to leave their homes. It might be that you lose your job because of war. It might be you lose a loved one who's died in battle, a family member. The list is big. War affects many people in a really big way, and I'm sure you've been following the news for the last few years about the Syrian crisis and the refugees who've had to leave their homes in Syria because of war. And when it comes to the victims of war, the list is sadly very long. So why do Christians care? Why do Christians care about victims of war? Now, you know a lot about Christianity already watching these videos and your own understanding in your own independent learning and just your knowledge about who Jesus was and what he taught. But why do Christians care about victims of war? Simply because Jesus does. Jesus cares about the victims of war, and therefore Christians care as well. Now, a really wonderful bit of poetry, bit of teaching from Saint Teresa of Avila. She wrote this, that Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks with compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks on to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes, yours are his body. Christ has no body now on earth but yours. Great poem. What this teaches Christians and reminds them is that Christians are the ambassadors of Jesus on earth today. A lot of the time when bad things happen and tragedies occur, people say, well, where is God? Well, Christians believe that they are his representatives on earth today. So when you see a tragedy occurring or you see great need in the world, it should be that you see Christians there who are helping people out in place of God, because they are his ambassadors. You'll hopefully all be familiar with the teaching of Jesus to love your neighbor. When Jesus was asked about who someone's neighbor is, he answered by giving them the parable of the Good Samaritan. And what the parable of the Good Samaritan teaches is that everyone is your neighbor. There's no one who's not your neighbor, and that includes your enemies, people of other cultures, races, backgrounds, beliefs. Everyone is your neighbor. And so for Christians, when they're thinking about victims of war, if they're here in the UK where there isn't any war at the moment, they should be thinking and caring for those overseas who've become the victims of tragedy and war. When it comes to what can Christians do, one thing that's helpful to know about is there's lots of Christian charities and groups who help victims of war. They include Tear Funds and Caritas, but they also include this group called Christian Peacemaker Teams. And these are amazing groups of Christians. This was a group set up by Mennonite, Brethren churches and Quakers. And these are groups of people who literally go into war zones to help the people in those areas. And if you go onto their website, you can see some of the specific things they do. But they go and they meet people who've been victims of war in the places where war has occurred. They advocate for them, they stand up for them, they speak for them, they spread the word about atrocities that have occurred or the fact that they need help, and they're just an amazing group who really offer practical help for people who are victims of war. When it comes to what can a Christian do, and this will be helpful if you're taking the GCSE on any questions where it says how can a Christian help or what can a Christian do about this, 3 things Christians can always do is they can pray and they can give their time and they can give their money. Now these are 3 generic things that you then want to make specific to the exam question. So if it says what can a Christian do to help victims of war, they can pray that the war will end. They can pray that people will comfort those who are mourning. They can pray that people will receive the help that they need. How can they use their time? Well, they can volunteer for a charity like Caritas or like Tear Fund and give their time to help those victims of war. Or they can go and meet with victims of war, people who are mourning perhaps, who need that help. They can also give their money. They can give their money to support any of those charities we've mentioned. So prayer, time and money are great things to come back to when you're thinking about how can an individual Christian help. So time to check your understanding. 5 questions and an extension. Pause the video here. When you're ready, unpause it and we'll look at the answers. Okay, hope you got along well with those. Let's look at some answers now. Number 1, who are the victims of war? Define the term and then give examples. So victims of war are anyone who've been negatively affected by a war. It might be soldiers who've been killed, civilians who've been killed, people who are mourning those who've been killed, people who've been injured, people who've lost jobs or homes or anything like that because of war. Why do Christians care about victims of war? Because Jesus cares about victims of war. And he taught to love your neighbour, and we know that because of the Good Samaritan, loving your neighbour applies to every single person. Shouldn't Christians just help other Christians? No. According to that story, love your neighbour, everyone is a Christian's neighbour, and therefore everyone should be helped regardless of their faith. How does Christian peacemaker teams help victims of war? They go out there and they work with the people who've become victims. They advocate for them, they speak up for them, and they spread awareness so that people are aware who they are and how much help they need. How can an individual Christian help victims of war? They can pray, they can give their time, and they can give their money. And then an extension there to look at this charity Christian Aid. Their slogan is "We believe in life before death." And what do you think it means by that? It means that rather than focusing on heaven and hell and the afterlife, which are of course important Christian principles, they also want to focus on the here and now and ensure that people are living their life to the full as Jesus requested. So that brings us to the end of this lesson, and let's just revisit that need to know. From today's lesson, you need to know that war in its nature creates many victims, and that Christians are commanded by Jesus to care about these victims and to care for their needs in practical ways. Thanks for being here today. Look forward to seeing you next lesson.